This episode of Let's Dig Deeper podcast is supported by the University of Copenhagen School of Archaeology. Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I'm a student of classical archaeology here at the University of Copenhagen, and on this podcast I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the delightful people working in the field. And we'll talk with archaeologists, historians, researchers, and professionals, and hopefully we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today is a very special day. It's our very first live episode of Let's Dig Deeper, and I'm sitting here in one of the rooms at the University of Copenhagen with our great audience. And I'm joined today by two wonderful guests, Seraina Nett and Sofie Schiødt. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Seraina, you are an Assyriologist and an expert in two of the most important languages of ancient Mesopotamia, meaning Sumerian and Akkadian. And your research interest lies in the socioeconomic history of the ancient Middle East. You're especially interested in the dynamics between different ethnic groups and social and linguistic groups. And Sofie, you are an Egyptologist with a background in archaeology and osteology, which is the study of bones. And your main focus is on ancient Egyptian social history. And you're also very interested in science and technology. And something I was really interested in, the relationship between medicine and magic. And you both have PhDs from the University of Copenhagen, where you're also affiliated as researchers and as lecturers. And today's topic is the birth of civilization, so from the Nile to the Euphrates. And we're talking about ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. But before we really dig into the topic of this evening, I think we need to get one thing straight. And that's because we're talking about these two ancient superpowers, we need to place ourselves somewhere in time and space. So, Seraina and Sofie, where do we find ourselves chronologically and geographically when we're talking about these two civilizations?
Yes, so chronologically, essentially, when we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we start with when writing is invented. So from the very, very earliest text, we're not quite sure when exactly that is year-wise, but somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200 before Christ, so about 5,000 years ago. And then, as an Assyriologist, I normally work until the end of cuneiform culture. So when cuneiform writing, this first writing system, stops being used, which is around the year 0. So we have more than 3,000 years of history that we are dealing with. Geographically, ancient Mesopotamia, so this is a Greek name for the region that means the two rivers, the land between the two rivers. And the two rivers are the Euphrates and the Tigris. So roughly ancient Mesopotamia corresponds to modern Iraq, essentially, with a little bit of Syria, a little bit of Iran, sort of kind of the region around it. But of course, culturally, it goes a lot beyond just ancient Iraq, but it goes all the way to the Syro-Palestinian coast, to Turkey and so forth. So this is quite a large cultural unit.
Yeah, and for ancient Egypt, we're kind of in the same temporal range, I would say. So we also usually say, Egyptology begins with the invention of writing. Everything before that is prehistory, and we mainly deal with history. And in Egypt, that's around 3,200 BCE, so before Common Era, before Christ. And the end of... It's difficult to, I would say most Egyptologists work with material up until around the 4th century CE, because we find the latest hieroglyph inscription in 395 CE. But there's a branch of Egyptology called Coptology, and they work with the Copts, so the Christians in Egypt. And technically this goes all the way up to modern times, right? So it's a bit difficult to say exactly the time frame that we're dealing with here. And geographically, it's much easier to explain than Mesopotamia, because ancient Egypt was more or less where Egypt is today, but kind of contrary to what modern Egypt is, where there's a lot of desert in the country. The ancient Egyptians considered Egypt only the fertile area around the Nile. Everything apart from that, like in the oases, for instance, they weren't really considered Egyptians, you would say. So this is kind of the general area that we're in.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that. So now let's dig deeper. And we often talk about early societies as the cradle of civilization, the place where the concept of society first evolved. But why did society first come to be in these two places in particular? Were there, I imagine there were certain conditions that had to be met, maybe about the space that there was there, or the people that were there, the climate, things like that?
Maybe I can begin because it kind of follows on from what I was saying before. The Egyptians considered Egypt as, the area around the Nile. And the Nile is also, it's fundamental for the civilization happening here. Without the Nile, there wouldn't be an ancient Egypt because everything else is desert in this area, right? So with the Nile, you get a fertile area where you can cultivate different crops, and this is what lays the foundation for ancient Egyptian civilization. So I would say this is the most important thing. But obviously, the ancient Egyptians also had, I wouldn't say easy, but let's say relatively easy access to a number of resources that also were very important for ancient civilization. So they had easy access to different kinds of stones that they used for their monumental buildings. They had easy access to different minerals that they used in medicine, for instance, to different metals that they used for tools, and so on and so on. So these are kind of the basic or the most important factors that we consider when we ask the question, why did civilization arise here?
And it's kind of similar in Mesopotamia, right?
Exactly. It's also very much dependent on the water, on the riverbeds, in our case, two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. And it's actually quite interesting in Mesopotamia itself because there are two regions. And especially for the earlier periods, it's more the southern region, what we call Babylonia, so the region kind of south of modern Baghdad. That is very important, where the first cities also are found. And what's quite interesting is that this region actually does not get enough rain to grow things. So to grow things, you need to take the water from the river and build canals, build artificial irrigation systems. And of course, to do that, they need to be maintained. You need to have a workforce to actually do that. And so to do that, you need some degree of social organization. And this is what we see in these very earliest periods. So we see people kind of moving away from the region just around it. So the foothills of the mountains, there's this concept called the Fertile Crescent, which is essentially this area stretching along the mountains on the kind of the Iraq-Iran border through the north, through northern Syria and down the Syro-Palestinian coast. And this is the region that gets just enough rain to grow things, to do agriculture without having extra irrigation. And this is also the region where farming was invented, where the first animals were actually domesticated. So we have natural wheat and barley that was then kind of grown to become like our modern wheat and barley crops. And this happens quite early on. This happens from about 10,000 BCE onwards. And so that happens in these foothills. And then we have at some point this shift in southern Iraq towards the riverbeds where they don't get enough rain. And there they actually have to dig canals. They have to have a social organization to grow these products. And so this is very much kind of goes hand in hand, that to be able to do agriculture there, you need to have complex society. When you actually have this complex society and these irrigation systems, you can produce quite a lot. This is very fertile with these two riverbeds. So you can grow overproduction of things like barley. You can produce a lot of wool and wool textiles. And so Babylonia, so southern Iraq, they actually produce quite a lot of this and they manage to sell it, which is very nice because they have no raw materials other than good soil, essentially, right? We're quite far away from the mountains. There's not that much stone. There's no trees. There's no metals, all the fancy luxury goods that you really want. If you're a 3000 BC person, you need to import that from further afield. You need to get it from all the way in Pakistan. You need to get it from Turkey, from Egypt, if we're talking about gold. And so they actually can produce barley and wool and fancy wool textiles that they then sell in exchange for all the luxury goods that they want. And this is kind of the start of how this region becomes so important and kind of the cities start growing in this region.
And city-states, they start forming in Mesopotamia, and there ends up being this concept of kingship in Egypt and like divine authority there, and then the cities have these individual rulers in Mesopotamia. And Egypt and Mesopotamia become these sort of neighboring civilizations. And you've already touched on it a little bit, that there might have been some trade, especially with gold involved. But did these two civilizations, did they develop independently? Or do we see some early signs of mutual interactions or influence?
We do see contacts. We do see contacts quite early on. We see objects that have clearly traveled quite far. We can see that there is some degree of interaction. It's in the earliest periods probably not super close interaction. So it's not as if Mesopotamia goes and conquers Egypt or something like that. That takes another 2,500 years before that happens. But we do see that there is contacts. And it's also maybe not so surprising that these things happen kind of in parallel in two regions that are quite similar in terms of the natural surroundings. Yeah, so there seems to be something going on from the earliest periods already.
Yeah, but of course it's really difficult to kind of interpret the evidence that we have, right? So say we find something in Egypt that was clearly made in Mesopotamia, but then, I mean, there are many different ways that that object can end up in Egypt, right? It doesn't have to be a direct kind of transaction or a direct connection between the two. It could travel with many different traders or so. So it's difficult to say like how close this sort of connection was between the two regions and exactly what it looked like and you know what it resulted in.
And one of the things that these early societies are most famous for contributing to human evolution is the art of writing, as I think one of you already mentioned briefly. And Egypt and Mesopotamia both developed different scripts for writing down information, and they looked pretty different too. And Seraina, can you tell us a little bit about the Mesopotamian writing system called cuneiform? Why was there suddenly a need for a writing system, first of all? And how did cuneiform then emerge?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So we think that the development of writing kind of goes hand in hand with these societal changes that we have happening at the end of the 4th millennium BC. So around 3400 BC, thereabouts. So we have this thing again, we have people moving to the lowlands, to the floodplains, working in irrigation. We see also for the first time, we see a person who may be a king or something similar. So we see in Mesopotamian art, there is a person who does ritual things, who seems to be involved in warfare to some degree. So there seems to be a hierarchy. We can see that also in artifacts, in pottery that is mass produced. So we suddenly have thousands of extremely ugly small bowls that are all exactly the same size. And it seems that's probably what people were given as payment for something in these little bowls. We see monumental architecture. So we suddenly see big buildings being built in the center of these cities. And we have in particular one city that becomes kind of the peak in that time period. And that's actually the city this period is named after, the city of Uruk in southern Iraq. We call this the Uruk period after this city. And Uruk at this time is the largest city in the world. It's absolutely massive. There's several 10,000s of people living there. And of course, you need to take care of that, right? You have people working in agriculture, you need to administer that. And we think that that was what was the original impetus for the invention of writing systems. And we can see actually that for quite a long time, they were experimenting with ways of counting, with ways of keeping records, until ultimately at the end of this period, around 3,400, 3,300, we see actual writing happening. And these early texts we don't understand very well. So they're quite complicated. It's mostly a logographic script, so one sign equals one word. So you really need to know how the system works to actually be able to read it. There's also lots and lots of different signs, because if you need a sign for each word that you have in your language, you quickly end up with a lot more than, 27 characters we have in alphabets these days. So this is an extremely complicated system, and it takes a very long time before it gets a bit more simplified. What's maybe also interesting, so cuneiform is impressed on clay, which is again the one thing they really have a lot of in Mesopotamia at this time. So you essentially take a lump of clay, you make a tablet, and then you impress the characters with a stylus, and this is kind of like a chopstick that has a little triangle at the end. And when you impress that in, that it gives it these characteristic shapes that look like little wedges. And that's why we call the writing system cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, because it kind of looks like funny little wedges. And what's maybe also interesting in that context is that cuneiform is not just used, so cuneiform is not a language. It is a writing system. And it is actually a writing system that is used for 3,000 years for at least 11 different languages. So it is then adapted to various different languages that are used in the region, and all the way again to Turkey, Iran, and so forth. The easternmost text in cuneiform writing that we have is from Afghanistan. The westernmost is from Italy. We have the southernmost is from Egypt, and the northernmost is from Russia. So it starts in Iraq, but it expands quite far. And there's definitely more than 500,000, up to 1 million documents that we have in cuneiform writing. So this is absolutely massive.
And Sofie, what then distinguishes the earliest hieroglyphs from cuneiform? How did the Egyptian writing system evolve? I mean, I know that, as you said, Seraina, cuneiform was mostly on clay, but hieroglyphs were on a completely different material, right?
Yeah. But I mean, you could say the reason for its invention is more or less the same as in Mesopotamia. You need to keep track of people and resources. But they use a very different medium. The earliest sources we have are kind of inscribed on little ivory tablets, but that's not so common. What you are probably familiar with is something like what you see on this image here, which is hieroglyphs inscribed in stone. But we only really find this in temples, in some of the early pyramids, but typically what people would use is papyrus, which was made from a plant. So basically you take the large stem of this papyrus plant and you cut it into like little thin slices, and then you put these slices kind of across from each other so that you build what looks like kind of a paper in the end. So it was more, let's say, more similar to what we have today or to what we know today. So they also used ink, so it's much more similar to something that we know. They didn't always use papyrus. They would also use something that we call ostraca, which it could be like little flakes of pottery or just stone flakes. So basically just objects that you can pick up from the ground anywhere in Egypt. Like, to those of you who have been in Egypt, you know that you find these everywhere, right? So you just basically pick it up from the ground and start writing.
And I have one last question before the break. So obviously writing wasn't as widespread back then as it is today. Not everyone knew how to write, not everyone had a reason to write something down. But who actually used writing in their daily life?
Yeah, it depends a bit on the time period. So we have some time periods where writing was a lot more widespread. The system is also extremely complicated. Again, originally you had one sign per word, essentially. There's also one sign can mean more than one word, and several signs can mean the same thing. So yeah, you need a lot of training. You need a lot more training than what we learn in school when we learn our sort of normal alphabet that we are used to. So yeah, not everybody could write. We have a large group of trained people, scribes, but also a lot of administrators that kind of work in middle management of all these administrative offices, and we have a lot of texts that they wrote. Obviously they wouldn't be writing literature or so forth. It's mostly, and actually the vast majority of the texts that we have are receipts, accounts, lists. So this is essentially, when you go to Netto and buy something, what you get there, 5 sheep and 2 liters of barley. This is the majority of the text. We have a lot of literature, but the vast majority is much simpler than that. And so we had a large group of people that were in charge of kind of recording things, counting things, writing things down. We do have 1 or 2 kings that claim that they could write, but most kings probably also used scribes and actually dictated what they were writing. We have, for some time periods, we have texts by maybe more normal people. We have, for example, in the Old Assyrian period, at the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, we have a colony of merchants where we have they're merchants, they have money, but we have them writing. We also have texts written by women. So there is quite a variation depending on space and time, but definitely fewer people than today.
Yeah, and it's the same for ancient Egypt. Traditionally, there was an estimate that said about 1% of the ancient Egyptian population could read and write. That's maybe a little bit too low. Let's say maybe 5% or so, but that's still, a very small portion of the population. And it was mostly priests, so members of the priesthood. And then we had scribes that were doing different administrative duties. But we do have one particularly interesting example from a little village in the middle of Egypt. And this village housed the people, the specialists who were engaged in building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. So they lived nearby, and so they had their own little village, and most people in this place could read and write. And so from this place we have a lot of daily life activities documented that we don't see in most other places in Egypt. So we have receipts for laundry or love letters, or there are a lot of law documents. So for instance, we know about this one guy called Paneb who apparently had an affair with many different women in the village. And so there are a lot of interesting insights into what life was like in kind of a normal Egyptian village.
Yeah. All right, thank you both so much for these answers. That's the end of our first session. We will now have a break around 10 minutes. And then when we come back, we're going to be talking a bit more in depth about myths, monuments, and legendary people from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Great. Great, we're now back from the break, and I hope everyone has found their seats as we now go into the second session of today. And we're going to be talking some more in depth about the myths, monuments, and legendary people from both Egypt and Mesopotamia. So, Seraina and Sofie, can you each tell us about a specific monument or a famous personality from the two regions? Is there someone or something that you would like to highlight?
I think I'll start with ancient Egypt. And I mean, obviously, I have to talk about the pyramids, right? I can actually do both a famous monument and a famous person in one. So when you say pyramids in Egypt, you also say Imhotep. And this is not the guy from the movie The Mummy, if you remember that from the 90s. This guy was seemingly a very powerful kind of servant of the king back in, this is like 2600 BCE. And he is, according to some sources, he was the guy who came up with the concept of the pyramid. And here on this image, you see the pyramids of Giza. These are slightly later. Imhotep came up with the first pyramid ever, which was a step pyramid. So it's kind of like a layered pyramid where the layers get smaller and smaller as you go up. And Imhotep, we actually don't have very many sources from his time, but in later times, he became this like very important person for several reasons. So he was obviously regarded as some sort of like maybe the first architect of the world. So a very important person in that regard. Somehow he also became like a patron deity for medicine. So you could go and pray to Imhotep if you had some sort of disease, then he could, well, hopefully help you. But this is something that we see kind of evolving throughout ancient Egyptian history. So even up until around like the 4th century BCE, they still regard him as a demigod or a god. So this is more than 2,000 years after he lived. This is really quite remarkable. And it also says something about how the ancient Egyptians regarded their own history. They were kind of Egyptologists in their own way. They were very interested in their own history and spent a lot of time kind of trying to get to know their ancestors as much as possible.
Yeah. And kind of following up on your pyramids, we do have something very similar from Mesopotamia. So we have a structure that looks a little bit like a pyramid or like a step pyramid, and that's the so-called zikkurat. But in Egypt, pyramids are very much for burials, right? They're graves. But zikkurats are not at all used as graves. They are essentially temples. They are temples that are put up on a platform, so they would be very visible. Many of the large cities in Mesopotamia had each their own zikkurat, their own temple tower, and you would really be able to see that from quite far away in the floodplain. Several are preserved. We have some from southern Mesopotamia, from southern Iraq. There's also some in the north, in Assyria, so in the Mosul region. There's some in Iran as well. So there were massive monuments, and some of them are still kind of visible in the landscape, as obviously they're made out of mud bricks, so they are eroded quite a bit, but they're still visible as towers. And of course, that maybe brings us to something that's also kind of relating to Mesopotamia, and that's the story of the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Babylon, which of course kind of relates to the zikkurat as a temple tower in Babylon. At least we think that the story of the Tower of Babylon in the Bible actually refers to the zikkurat, the temple tower in the city of Babylon. So we have quite a lot of sources about this temple tower in Babylon. Babylon is in the slightly south of Baghdad, and they had this actual temple tower that was very famous, has been described by Herodotus amongst others. It was called Etemenanki, which means house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. And this was this massive, enormous structure. Because the story made it into the Bible, there's quite a lot of art that relates to the Tower of Babylon, and maybe you have seen some of these paintings. Yeah, they normally show a round tower with a kind of a round spiral staircase around the outside. That's not at all how the Tower of Babylon looked like at all. This is likely inspired by the mosque in Samarra, which is round and has a spiral tower. But so people actually drawing this, they had no idea how the Tower of Babylon looked like. The reason they don't know that is that today it's a square hole in the ground, but it's definitely square. So when Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, he saw that the tower had been falling apart and he decided to renovate it. So they took away a lot of the bricks that were left, and they were planning to build this square big tower from scratch, from the bottom up. But Alexander the Great died in Babylon when he was still relatively young, when he was in his early 30s. So he actually never managed to finish the renovation.
I know I'm not the interviewer, but can I ask a question? Do you have like stone monuments then? Or is it all mud brick, the large monuments that you have from Mesopotamia?
Buildings are all mud brick
Yeah.
for the most part. We do have stelae and statues that are made out of stone, but yeah, there's really very little stone right nearby, so you have to import the stone. A lot of the stone comes from Iran, from various regions bordering Iraq, and the nicer, fancier stones are also imported from a bit further afield. Some is coming from Oman via the Gulf Coast. But yeah, no, buildings at least in southern Iraq, are essentially just made out of mud brick, clay. There's very little stone.
And you already quickly mentioned the way Imhotep became this sort of mythical deity, but what are some famous myths that originate from these two places? Obviously, we can't go through the whole myths of the entire pantheons. That's something people could dedicate their whole careers to studying. But what are some of the most important or interesting stories from Egypt and Mesopotamia?
Yeah, I think for Mesopotamia, the most famous myth by far is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a narrative about a mythical king of the city of Uruk. So again, this early city where writing was invented. Yeah, the classical version that we normally talk about with the Epic of Gilgamesh is the so-called Standard Babylonian version. It was probably written down between 1200, 1000 BCE, but most of the copies that we have are from a bit later, from around 700 BCE. And yeah, the most important copies that we have of this epic, they come from the library of King Ashurbanipal, who was a king in Assyria, so in the Mosul region in northern Iraq, who had this massive library with thousands and thousands of texts. And among these texts, we have the story about King Gilgamesh. And what's quite interesting is that there's actually, these stories go thousands of years back. So we have a lot of prehistory of this story, lots of stories around King Gilgamesh. But then at some point, it was kind of written down as a standard narrative. And this is kind of a classic hero's journey narrative. It touches upon a lot of themes that are also still relevant today about civilization, what civilization is, the quest for immortality, friendship. So this is quite a relatable story, I would say. And it's about this king, Gilgamesh, and he's not a historical king, but he was considered a historical king by the Mesopotamians, a bit like Imhotep. And Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and he's this larger-than-life, over-the-top person. He is 2/3 god, 1/3 human, so he's kind of stronger and bigger than everybody else, and he's really annoying his local population. He's fighting with all the men, and everybody is extremely fed up with him. So they ask the gods to do something about this extremely annoying king that they have, and the gods then bring the wild man Enkidu. The wild man Enkidu is kind of the opposite. So Gilgamesh is civilization, is city life, and Enkidu is kind of the wilderness. And they fight for a long time, and then at some point they become friends, as you do when you fight for a long time, and then they go on a bunch of adventures together. They go to the cedar forest, which is probably modern Lebanon, where they fight against this mountain demon Humbaba and bring some trees back to Mesopotamia. Again, there's not a lot of wood in southern Mesopotamia, so if you want nice tree, you import it from Lebanon. So they go on all these quests, and yeah, because they are big and strong, the goddess of love and war, Ishtar, becomes very interested in King Gilgamesh, and she finds him extremely attractive, and she kind of suggests certain things to him, but Gilgamesh is not interested, and he turns her down. And Ishtar, she has quite a strong personality. She has a bit of a temper, so she gets absolutely furious. And she goes to her father, the sky god An, and she asks for Gilgamesh to be punished because he turned her down, because that's just not something you do. And she gets extremely annoying. She threatens to raise the dead, and the dead will outnumber the living in the world. So she's extremely mad. And so she manages to convince the gods to send the bull of heaven, which is this mythical large bull, to come to Earth and wreak havoc, essentially. So this bull comes and destroys everything. He drinks the waters of the Euphrates, so the water level lowers and it's absolute chaos. And then Gilgamesh and Enkidu come and kill that bull. And they are so annoyed at Ishtar that Enkidu even throws the leg of the bull at her, kind of to annoy her, essentially. And as a result for that, the gods decide that one of them has to die. And they decide to kill Enkidu. And Enkidu then gets ill and dies. So he does not die in battle. And he's extremely upset by that, which is because it's really unfair that he is suddenly killed. And again, he doesn't even get the good death. He has to die from illness. And eventually he dies. And Gilgamesh is extremely upset. So there's a very long passage where he's crying and screaming and mourning his friend. And then Gilgamesh decides that he does not want to die. And so he goes on a quest to find eternal life, to find immortality. And to do that, he has to talk to the one person who is actually immortal. So the only human ever who does not have to die. And this is a guy called Utnapishtim. And then we have an extremely long passage towards the end of the epic where this guy Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh why he is immortal. So it's kind of a story in the story. And Utnapishtim, he was rescued when the gods sent a big flood. And he was rescued because one of the gods warned him, and he built a boat where he brought a lot of different animals. And in that boat, him and the animals survived that flood. That story might sound slightly familiar. It's essentially parallel to the biblical narrative of the flood. And ultimately, Utnapishtim survives the flood. He offers sacrifices to the gods. As a thank you, he's made immortal, so he doesn't have to die. So he tells that story to Gilgamesh, and then he gives Gilgamesh a task. And if Gilgamesh can do that, he will also become immortal. Gilgamesh has to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, but Gilgamesh can't do it. He falls asleep. So he fails. Then he gets a second chance and he's given a herb that makes him immortal. But then a snake comes out of the blue in a bit of a plot twist and steals that herb. So Gilgamesh still will have to die. But then he returns to his city, Uruk, and he realizes this city is so big and so famous, and the walls of Uruk are so massive that he will live on in the fame of this city. And that's kind of fun because we are still sitting here essentially, 5,000 years after that story would have taken place and 3,000 years after it was written down, and we are still talking about it. So in a way, Gilgamesh actually was right about his fame.
His name lives on.
His name lives on.
And Sofie, is there a story like that from Egypt as well?
There's a similar kind of thing in terms of the techniques that they use to tell these stories. And maybe it's not quite as plot twisty, but there is quite a famous story. We call it the shipwrecked sailor. The story starts with 2 sailors who are returning from an expedition abroad, and we don't really know why, but they're clearly unsatisfied with what they've accomplished. And so the leader of this expedition is kind of worried about going to the king because he's afraid there might be some repercussions because he hasn't been quite as successful as he had hoped. And so he's talking to one of his subordinates about this. And then the subordinate is like, you shouldn't worry about this. I'll tell you a story of something that happened to me to put it into perspective. And so then we get the first story within the story. And so he tells this story about another time when he went sailing and he was caught with the rest of the crew in a storm and the ship sank. Everyone died except the sailor. He woke up at some distant island. He finds out very quickly that the island has everything that you could want. All of the food you could want and all of the myrrh, all of the incense, whatever, you name it, everything is on this island. And then suddenly the ground starts to shake and he thinks that it's an earthquake, but when in reality it's a massive snake coming towards him. The text specifies that the snake is 30 cubits long, so 15 meters. And the snake carries him away in his mouth to his lair, his evil lair, and then asks him what he's doing on the island. And the sailor replies that he was washed ashore. He doesn't know where he is. It was an accident. And then the snake tells him, take heart, you should overcome these difficulties, and I can help you do that by sharing a story that I've experienced. So then you get the second story within the story. And then the snake tells this story about how he once experienced probably something like a comet that crashed on the island. It's described as like a flying star or something like this. And this comet killed off his entire family. All 74 members of his snake family were killed. But then he tells the sailor, I overcame this and you can do the same. And if you believe in divine justice, then in 4 months' time, some sailors that will come by this island and they will pick you up and they will take you back home. And everything happens as the snake has told the sailor. And then, we come to the beginning of the tale again, where the sailor is talking to his superior. The purpose is to just say, you can overcome all of these difficulties if you just believe in yourself and in divine justice.
Interesting that there are snakes in both these stories, but play very different roles. And now we're reaching towards the end of this interview, and my final question is also about the end of these civilizations. I'm putting end in air quotes because I think it's a pretty common misconception that the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Mesopotamians just suddenly disappeared or the societies just ceased to exist. But that's not really the case in reality. As I understand it, it was more of a gradual decline and sort of this immersion into newer regimes. So how did the ancients then disappear, if you can say that?
Yeah, so from Mesopotamia, the thing that changes dramatically in the first millennium BCE is that we have the invention of the alphabet. We have a big shift in what is written and how it is written. So we have still cuneiform tablets on clay until, again, the 1st century CE. Increasingly, they start writing in alphabet on other materials, not on clay, which also means we have a lot less sources, and the sources are a lot different because clay is really nice. Clay preserves. So you always find that in excavations. There's also a shift in the languages that are being used. So the languages that are traditionally written in cuneiform on clay get replaced by other languages, such as especially Aramaic. And then from 539 BCE onwards, we also have increasingly foreign, in quotation marks, dynasties ruling over the region. So we have the Persian Empire coming in, the Achaemenid, the old Persian Empire, and conquering Babylon and making it the center of the empire, but there's still a foreign dynasty that also promotes their own language, for example. After that, we have Alexander the Great. And then you have a lot of Greeks moving in. Then we have 2 more Persian empires controlling it. So it's also, there's a lot of absorption of the evidence that we do have. But again, some things are maintained. Mesopotamian traditions, they still, for another few hundred years, keep writing cuneiform, especially in temples, because temples tend to be a bit more conservative than other parts of society. But also there's still cultural memory of these Mesopotamian stories. So there's Mesopotamian myths that are, for example, via Alexander the Great, are transported to Europe and interact with Greek mythology. We have Mesopotamian science, mathematics, astronomy, and so forth, that via the Persians makes it to Iran and further to India. So there's also things that live on. This is not something that just disappears, but there are reflexes of that in the later neighboring cultures.
Mm-hmm. And what about Egypt?
I mean, it's kind of a similar situation. Seraina mentioned the Persians and the Greeks. It's the same in Egypt. With the Romans as well, they all, I want to say, take turns ruling the country for a certain period of time, which obviously changes the social fabric of the country. But I mean, you have the same, cultural phenomena that persist throughout this time. And I would argue that even continue to this day. So I don't think that we can really talk about it being completely gone. I mean, if you look at how life is like in the Egyptian countryside, it probably doesn't differ that much today from how it was in ancient times. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but the Egyptians today, they take great pride in their history. And you can also see it in the way that they kind of use their ancient history in the narrative about the country. And it's also used politically, right? I mean, I think we can't really talk about like a clear divide, this is ancient Egypt and everything else is different. There are for sure things that last up until this day.
And then eventually there's the Arab conquest of the whole Middle East, and that sort of unifies it in a different cultural sphere, right? All right. So that marks the end of this episode. Seraina and Sofie, thank you so much for joining us. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone with us here today, this evening, and everyone listening in online. Remember that you can find many more episodes of Let's Dig Deeper on all platforms, including one with Ingolf Thusen about ancient Mesopotamia. If you'd like to get in touch, you can write to us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com, and you can find me, the host, on Instagram @zarchaeology. And I'll see you next time, where we will dig deeper into another topic. Thank you very much.